The desert sun beat down on the weathered face of James Sullivan as he stood among the steel giants that had defined his life. At 75, his posture remained military straight, shoulders squared against time itself. The tanks around him weren't just machines, they were old comrades, witnesses to a lifetime of service that had spanned 3 wars and countless battles. Some called him Iron Jack behind his back. Some said it to his face. After 50 years around tanks, the nickname had fused with his identity like armor plating. Sullivan ran a calloused hand along the metal flank of an M1 Abrams, feeling the familiar contours through muscle memory that no amount of aging could erase. His private tank training academy in the Texas flatlands had become something of a legend among military circles. Young recruits who passed through Sullivan's program emerged with something the regular Army couldn't quite provide: the wisdom of experience that no computer simulation could replace. "You're favoring your right side again, Jenkins," Sullivan called out to a young man attempting to execute a maintenance procedure on an engine block. "Enemy fire doesn't give a damn about your comfort. Balance yourself." The recruit adjusted immediately. They always did. Sullivan's voice carried the weight of authority that came not from rank but from survival. The rumble of an approaching vehicle drew Sullivan's attention away from his students. A black SUV with government plates kicked up dust as it approached across the training yard. Sullivan recognized his son's driving immediately. Precise, efficient, military. Tom Sullivan had followed in his father's footsteps to a point, opting for the skies rather than the ground, flying helicopters instead of commanding tanks. Now at 40, he worked as a defense contractor, moving in circles his father viewed with a mixture of pride and suspicion. Sullivan watched his son emerge from the vehicle, noting the stiff formality in Tom's movements that always emerged when he visited the academy. Their relationship had the same tension as tank treads, functional but never quite smooth. "Dad," Tom nodded, sunglasses hiding his eyes as he approached. "You're early," Sullivan replied, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Briefing isn't until 1400. Tom removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes identical to his father's. "That's why I'm here. There's been a development. We need to talk privately." Sullivan nodded toward his office, a converted shipping container at the edge of the training field. Inside, military precision organized everything from the books on tank warfare to the coffee cups. The walls were adorned with maps of battlefields where Sullivan had commanded steel beasts: Vietnam, Iraq, Kuwait. Photographs showed younger versions of himself standing proudly with various tank crews, their faces reflecting the brotherhood formed within the confines of armored vehicles. Tom didn't sit. "The Westfield development deal is moving forward. They've expedited the purchase of this land." Sullivan remained impassive, though the news hit like an armor-piercing round. "The lease runs another 8 months. They found a loophole, environmental assessment clause." Tom placed a document on the desk. "They're claiming the tanks pose a contamination risk to the watershed." "Bullshit!" Sullivan didn't raise his voice. He never had to. "Maybe, but it's bullshit with legal standing. They want you out in 30 days. Sullivan studied his son's face, looking for some hint of the boy who once begged for stories about tanks, who played with model Pattons and Abrams on the living room floor. That boy had disappeared somewhere between Sullivan's 3rd deployment and his wife's funeral. "Who's behind Westfield? Really behind it?" Tom hesitated, and Sullivan knew instantly that his son was weighing military contractor loyalties against family obligation. "Argent Defense Systems is the parent company," Tom finally said. The revelation wasn't surprising. Argent had been pushing autonomous tank systems for years, attempting to remove human operators from the battlefield equation entirely. Sullivan had been their most vocal and respected critic, leveraging his war record and expertise to argue against removing the human element from armored warfare. "So they're not just buying land, they're buying silence." Sullivan moved to the small window, looking out at his students working on the tanks. "How long have you known?" "Long enough to try to stop it." Tom's voice carried a defensive edge. "I've been working back channels. That's why I'm here early. I found something, or someone." This caught Sullivan's attention. "Who?" "Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the War College, military historian. She's been researching your old unit for a book on Desert Storm, specifically Black Iron." Sullivan went still. Black Iron had been classified for decades. The special tank unit he'd commanded during the Gulf War had captured and analyzed Iraqi T-72s, providing critical intelligence that had saved countless American lives. Their findings had revolutionized tank combat tactics, though few outside the highest levels of command even knew the unit existed. How much does she know? Enough to help us make a case for historical preservation. The Pentagon's declassifying some Gulf War operations next month. Black iron is among them. Sullivan considered this years of tactical thinking, automatically assessing angles and opportunities. Arrange a meeting. Tom nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. There's something else. I found this while accessing some of Argent's secure servers. He handed Sullivan a thumb drive. They're not just developing autonomous tanks. They're actively working to discredit traditional tank doctrine, including your methods. Sullivan took the drive, studying it like an unexploded ordnance. And you're giving this to me? Isn't this the kind of thing that ends careers at places like Argento? A flicker of the sun Sullivan remembered appeared in Tom's eyes. Some things matter more than careers, Dad. The words hung between them, loaded with decades of unspoken conversations. Sullivan simply nodded, recognizing the magnitude of what his son was risking. 1400. Bring Dr. Mitchell. Sullivan pocketed the drive. Now let me finish teaching these kids how to stay alive inside 70 tons of moving metal. As Tom left, Sullivan turned back to the window, his mind already mapping the battle to come. Not with missiles and shells this time, but with history and truth as ammunition. His eyes drifted to an old photograph on his desk, a young Lieutenant Sullivan standing beside his first command, an M48 Patton tank in Vietnam, 1969, the beginning of a journey that had defined him. The past called to him then, as it often did in moments of crisis. Memories rose like smoke from a burning tank. Harvard University, 1968. The campus erupted with anti-war protests as James Sullivan sat in his dormitory, reading his father's latest letter from Fort Benning. The elder Sullivan, a decorated tank commander from World War II, wrote of duty and honor while outside James's window. Students burned draft cards and chanted against the military-industrial complex. James had been raised on stories of Sherman tanks pushing through European forests, of the brotherhood formed inside those metal beasts. His father, Thomas Sullivan, had commanded tanks across France and Germany, part of a family tradition of military service that stretched back to the Civil War. That night, while classmates planned their next protest, James Sullivan packed his bags, withdrew from Harvard, and volunteered for officer candidate school. The decision shattered his mother's dreams of having raised a scholar, but his father understood. Some men were born for books, others for battle. 6 months later, Second Lieutenant James Sullivan stood in the humid air of Vietnam, staring at the Patton tank that would become his first command. The M48 looked both monstrous and magnificent. 60 tons of American engineering designed to dominate battlefields. The smell of diesel fuel, gun oil, and steel created a perfume that would follow him for decades. "She's all yours, Lieutenant," the departing tank commander said, handing over the vehicle log. "Watch the left tread tension, and don't trust the fuel gauge. She drinks more than she admits." Sullivan walked the perimeter of the vehicle, taking in every detail, from the 90mm main gun to the 50 caliber machine gun mounted on the turret. This wasn't just a machine, it was a responsibility, measured in the lives of the crew who would serve under him. "You the new meat?" a voice called from behind. Sullivan turned to see a tall black man with medical insignia on his collar, though he also wore tanker's coveralls. "Lieutenant Sullivan," he confirmed, extending his hand. "Lieutenant Michael Williams. Everyone calls me Doc." The man's handshake was firm, his eyes evaluating. "I'm your gunner and medic, 2-for-1 special." Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "Medical training and gunnery? Unusual combination." Doc's expression remained neutral. "I like keeping people alive, Lieutenant. Sometimes that means patching them up. Sometimes that means killing what's trying to kill them. Tank crew needs both skills." It was the beginning of a partnership that would span decades and battlefields across the world. Doc Williams became Sullivan's right hand, their different backgrounds fading against the shared experience of war. Doc had grown up in Detroit, the son of an auto worker, learning mechanics alongside medicine from an uncle who ran a free clinic above his garage. The rest of the crew arrived over the next days. Sergeant Frank Rodriguez, a mechanical genius from New Mexico who could diagnose tank problems by sound alone, earning him the nickname Wrench, and Private Billy Thompson, a Cherokee from Oklahoma with uncanny accuracy on the main gun, quietly christened Eagle Eye after his first combat operation. Together, they formed the crew of Iron Vengeance, the name painted on their tank's hull by the previous crew and kept as a matter of tradition. Sullivan quickly learned that tank crews were superstitious, treating their vehicles with an almost religious reverence. Their first weeks were spent on routine operations, escorting supply convoys, providing fire support for infantry sweeps, learning the rhythm of war. Sullivan absorbed everything, studying maps by flashlight, questioning more experienced commanders, determined to keep his crew alive in a conflict that devoured young men daily. The true test came 3 months into his tour, during a support operation near the Cambodian border. Their column of 5 tanks was escorting a supply convoy when the jungle erupted with RPG fire. Sullivan heard the distinctive whoosh before he saw the flash. Instinct, rather than training, driving him to order an immediate left turn, presenting the stronger frontal armor toward the attack. The first RPG glanced off the turret, the impact reverberating through the tank like a giant hammer strike. Sullivan's vision blurred momentarily from the concussion. "Contact left! Multiple hostiles!" Doc's voice came through the intercom, steady despite the chaos. "Traversing!" Thompson responded, rotating the main gun toward the attackers. Sullivan spotted enemy movement through his vision blocks. "Hostiles in the tree line, 11 o'clock. He round." "Identified," Thompson called. "Ready? Fire!" The 90mm gun roared, the tank rocking slightly with the recoil. The high explosive round tore into the jungle, splintering trees and silencing one RPG position. "Driver, forward 10 meters, then hard right," Sullivan ordered, positioning for a better firing angle while keeping the supply trucks protected behind their armor. Rodriguez executed the maneuver flawlessly, the tank responding like an extension of his will. Sullivan had learned quickly that a tank was only as good as the synchronicity of its crew, each man performing specialized functions that together created a devastating war machine. The battle continued for 20 minutes that stretched like hours, with Iron Vengeance and the other tanks methodically eliminating enemy positions while absorbing occasional hits. Sullivan's crew functioned with increasing efficiency with each engagement, the lessons from training crystallizing under fire. As the enemy fire diminished, Sullivan ordered his driver to advance, providing cover for infantry to secure the area. They had almost reached the edge of the contested zone when Sullivan heard Wrench swear over the intercom. "Something's wrong with hydraulic pressure. Port side dropping." Before Sullivan could process this, a tremendous impact rocked the tank. An RPG had found the vulnerable spot between hull and turret, penetrating just enough to damage internal systems without fully breaching the crew compartment. Alarms blared as smoke began filling the interior. "Status!" Sullivan demanded, fighting to maintain control of the situation. "Fire in the engine compartment," Rodriguez reported. "Losing power." "Thompson, you okay?" Sullivan called to his gunner, who had taken the brunt of the concussion. "I'm good, sir," came the shaky reply. Sullivan made the decision instantly. "Prepare to abandon. Doc, help Thompson. Wrench, kill the electrical." The procedure they had drilled countless times now unfolded in deadly earnest. Sullivan secured classified materials while his crew prepared to exit a vehicle that could become their coffin in seconds. The smell of burning electronics and fuel filled the compartment as temperature rose rapidly. "Go, go, go," Sullivan ordered, popping his hatch and scanning for threats before emerging. Doc was already pulling Thompson from the gunner's position, the younger man dazed but moving. Sullivan helped Rodriguez extract himself from the driver's compartment. Then all 4 men scrambled away from the disabled tank, seeking cover behind a nearby bomb crater. Seconds later, ammunition and Iron Vengeance began cooking off, rounds exploding as fire reached the storage compartments. As they huddled in the crater, incoming fire still snapping overhead, Sullivan watched his first command burn. The tank that had been their home and protection was now a 60-ton funeral pyre, black smoke billowing into the Vietnam sky. Doc Williams examined Thompson's head wound, applying a bandage with practiced efficiency. "He'll be okay, just bell rung." Sullivan nodded, then turned to see Rodriguez staring at the burning tank with naked anguish, as though watching a family member die. "We'll get another wrench," Sullivan said, gripping the man's shoulder. Rodriguez didn't look away from the flames. "Won't be the same." "No," Sullivan agreed, understanding completely. "It never is." That night, after being recovered by another tank from their column, Sullivan sat alone writing condolence letters to the families of 2 infantry soldiers killed in the ambush. The responsibility weighed on him, made heavier by the knowledge that decisions he made directly impacted who lived and died. Doc Williams found him there, offering a canteen of water that Sullivan suspected was spiked with something stronger. "First rule of tank combat," Doc said after Sullivan took a drink. Get out of that baby when she's hit. You don't want to burn up in it. Sullivan nodded, handing back the canteen. We were lucky. Wasn't luck, Doc countered. You made the right call at the right time. Crew walks away. That's a victory in my book. The simple statement became a cornerstone of Sullivan's command philosophy throughout his career. Crew survival, above all. Tanks could be replaced. Trained crews with battle experience were irreplaceable. Their next tank arrived a week later, another M48 with fresh paint and no name. The crew inspected every inch, Rodriguez making modifications based on lessons learned from their first vehicle's destruction. Sullivan watched them transform from shaken survivors to determined veterans, the near-death experience binding them together more effectively than months of routine operations. Thompson suggested naming the new tank Phoenix, but Rodriguez shook his head. Too obvious, the mechanic said. Everyone names replacement tanks Phoenix. Iron Will, Doc offered, because that's what got us out of the last one. The name stuck, painted on the hull in bold letters by Rodriguez's steady hand. Iron Will became their home for the remainder of Sullivan's first tour, surviving countless engagements and earning recognition from command for exceptional performance. When Sullivan received orders for rotation back to the States after his first year, he fought to keep his crew together, leveraging commendations they'd received to ensure all 4 men would remain a unit. It was unusual but not unprecedented, especially for tank crews with proven combat effectiveness. Before leaving Vietnam, Sullivan received a letter from his father, congratulating him on surviving his first year of combat. The elder Sullivan included a small metal tankard that had traveled with him through Europe during World War II. A tank man's good luck charm, the letter explained. It saw me through Normandy to Berlin. May it serve you as well. Sullivan carried that tankard through every subsequent deployment, a talisman connecting him to a heritage of armored warfare that stretched back through generations. It symbolized not just his family's military tradition, but the evolution of tank combat itself, from his father's Shermans to his own increasingly sophisticated vehicles. Between Vietnam and his next combat deployment, Sullivan advanced through the ranks, his experience and aptitude for armored warfare earning him accelerated promotion. He served as an instructor at Fort Knox, training the next generation of tank commanders while studying the changing nature of armored conflict. The transition from the M48 Patton to the M60 and eventually the revolutionary M1 Abrams marked technological leaps that transformed how tanks operated on the battlefield. Sullivan embraced these changes while maintaining his core philosophy. The human element remained the decisive factor in tank warfare. This belief put him at odds with certain Pentagon officials and defense contractors who viewed automation as the future. Sullivan became known as an officer who spoke truth regardless of political consequences, his combat record providing a shield against those who might otherwise have ended his career. His expertise in Soviet tank capabilities, gained through intensive study and occasional classified operations, made him particularly valuable during the Cold War years. Sullivan could describe from memory the specifications and vulnerabilities of every tank in the Warsaw Pact arsenal, knowledge that would prove critical during his command of Black Iron during the Gulf War. Throughout this period, Sullivan maintained contact with his original crew. Doc Williams followed him through various assignments, their partnership becoming legendary within armored divisions. Rodriguez eventually transferred to maintenance command, overseeing tank modifications that incorporated lessons from the field. Thompson completed officer candidate school, commanding his own tank before a leg injury resulted in reassignment to intelligence work. Sullivan's personal life developed in the shadow of his military career. He married Elizabeth Garrett, a professor of military history he met while guest lecturing at West Point. Their relationship flourished despite frequent separations, Elizabeth understanding the call of duty that defined her husband's existence. Their son Thomas was born in 1984 during a rare period of domestic assignment. Sullivan was present for the birth, standing tall in his uniform as he held his son for the first time. He remembered thinking that this tiny being represented a different kind of legacy, one not measured in battles won or medals earned. As Tom grew, Sullivan struggled to balance fatherhood with his military obligations. He missed birthdays and school events, returning from deployments to find his son changed in ways he hadn't witnessed. Elizabeth bridged these gaps, maintaining family cohesion despite Sullivan's absences. "He wants to be like you," Elizabeth told him during one home leave. As they watched 7-year-old Tom playing with tank models in the living room, "He needs to know the man, not just the soldier." Sullivan tried, sharing sanitized war stories and explaining tank mechanics to his fascinated son. These moments of connection were precious but insufficient against the backdrop of prolonged separation. The gulf between father and son widened with each deployment, creating a distance that would eventually transform into the tension that characterized their adult relationship. In August 1990, when Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait, Sullivan was commanding a tank battalion at Fort Hood. The call to deploy came swiftly, his unit designated as part of the massive American response to Saddam Hussein's aggression. At 43, Sullivan was older than many of his fellow commanders, his experience making him a natural choice for complex operations. The night before deployment, he sat with 11-year-old Tom, trying to explain why he had to go, why this war mattered. Elizabeth watched from the doorway, her academic understanding of military history providing context that Sullivan's direct experience could not. "Will you drive a tank, Dad?" Tom asked, eyes wide with a child's romanticized view of war. "No, son. I'll be commanding many tanks, making sure they're in the right place at the right time." "Will you be in danger?" Sullivan considered lying, then met his son's gaze directly. "Yes, but I'm very good at what I do, and I have the best men in the Army with me." Tom nodded, absorbing this with the solemnity that children of military parents often develop early. "Mom says you're the best tank commander in the whole Army." Sullivan glanced at Elizabeth, who smiled softly. "Your mother exaggerates, but I promise you this, I will do everything in my power to come home safe." It was a promise he intended to keep, not just for his family, but for every soldier under his command. The lessons from Vietnam remained etched in his consciousness. Decisions made in the chaos of battle determined who returned home and who remained forever in foreign soil. The deployment to Saudi Arabia occurred with remarkable speed, America's military machine mobilizing for its largest operation since Vietnam. Sullivan found himself responsible for a battalion of the new M1 Abrams tanks, their capabilities far exceeding anything he had commanded previously. The desert presented unique challenges for armored warfare: extreme heat affecting electronics, sand infiltrating sensitive components, vast open spaces that eliminated much of the concealment tactics relied upon in other environments. Sullivan drilled his units relentlessly, preparing for combat under these conditions. 2 weeks into the deployment, Sullivan received unexpected orders to report to a secure facility near the Saudi-Kuwaiti border. There he found Doc Williams waiting, now wearing the oak leaves of a major and looking distinctly uncomfortable in his pressed desert uniform. "They're putting the band back together, Jack," Doc said, using the nickname that had followed Sullivan since Vietnam. "What band is that exactly?" Doc handed him a folder with classified markings. "Something called Black Iron. Apparently you've been specially requested." The folder contained orders creating a specialized tank unit with an unusual mission: capture and analyze Iraqi armor, particularly the Soviet-built T-72s that formed the backbone of Saddam's tank forces. The mission required commanders with extensive knowledge of both American and Soviet tank design. Sullivan's name headed the short list of qualified officers, his expertise in Soviet armored warfare making him the natural choice to lead this sensitive operation. "Why me, Doc? There are younger men with more recent combat experience." Doc's expression remained serious. "Because you're the only colonel in the Army who can identify every variant of the T-72 by the sound of its engine alone. And because you've been arguing for years that our intelligence on Soviet tanks is incomplete." It was true. Sullivan had long maintained that American assessments of Soviet armor capabilities were flawed, based on export models rather than the actual vehicles deployed by Warsaw Pact forces. This mission represented an opportunity to prove his theories and potentially save American lives. "Who else is coming?" Sullivan asked. "Rodriguez is already here. Thompson's flying in tomorrow from intelligence, and about 20 specialists you don't know yet." Sullivan felt something stir within him, a combination of anticipation and purpose that transcended standard pre-combat tension. This wasn't just another mission, it was the culmination of decades of study and experience, a chance to make a difference beyond the direct impact of battlefield command. "When do we start?" "Yesterday," Doc replied with a grim smile. "We have 6 weeks before the ground war kicks off." Black Iron officially activated the next day, operating under the cover of a standard reconnaissance unit while assembling specialized equipment for their true purpose. Their base of operations became a fortified compound near the expected invasion routes, equipped with technical facilities for analyzing captured vehicles. Sullivan reunited with Sergeant Major Frank "Wrench" Rodriguez, now the Army's foremost expert on tank maintenance and modification. The years had added gray to Rodriguez's hair, but none to his enthusiasm for mechanical challenges. "Good to see you, Colonel," Rodriguez said, saluting with uncharacteristic formality before breaking into a broad grin. "Still carrying that old tankard?" Sullivan patted his breast pocket where the metal cup from his father rested. "Some traditions you don't break." Major Billy Thompson arrived from Washington with a team of intelligence officers and technical specialists. His old injury had left him with a slight limp, but his mind remained as sharp as his former aim. "Colonel Sullivan," Thompson greeted him. "Intelligence says the Iraqis have modified their T-72s. Extended range on the main guns, improved armor. If true, our current tactics may need adjustment." This confirmed Sullivan's long-held suspicions. The standard American approach to engaging Soviet bloc tanks relied on specific vulnerability assumptions that might no longer apply with modified vehicles. The mission took on greater urgency as Operation Desert Storm's air campaign began in January 1991. While coalition aircraft pounded Iraqi positions, Black Iron prepared for the ground phase, developing specialized tools and techniques for quickly assessing captured armor. Sullivan personally selected the tank crews who would support the operation, choosing experienced commanders with mechanical aptitude. Each received crash courses in Soviet tank design, focusing on extraction of key components and safing procedures. 2 days before the ground invasion began, Sullivan gathered his core team for a final briefing. The stakes had increased as intelligence reported Iraqi Republican Guard units equipped with the latest T-72 variants moving to defensive positions. "Gentlemen," Sullivan addressed the assembled officers, "in 48 hours, American tanks will engage the Republican Guard's armored divisions. Our mission is to capture intact examples of their tanks, analyze their capabilities, and provide immediate tactical updates to our advancing forces." He gestured to a map showing the expected movement of coalition forces. "We'll follow the main advance, securing disabled but intact enemy armor before they can be destroyed or sabotaged. Time will be critical. We need answers while the battle is still underway." Doc Williams spoke up. "Medical indicates Republican Guard units have been issued chemical warfare gear. We're preparing accordingly." Sullivan nodded grimly. The threat of chemical weapons had hung over the entire operation, adding an additional layer of danger to an already hazardous mission. "Any questions?" Sullivan asked. Thompson raised his hand. "Sir, what if we discover the T-72s are more capable than our intelligence suggests? What if our M1s are more vulnerable than we've been led to believe?" The question cut to the heart of Sullivan's own concerns. American confidence in the superiority of the Abrams was absolute among Pentagon planners. Any evidence to the contrary would face institutional resistance. "Then we tell the truth, Major, regardless of who doesn't want to hear it." Sullivan's expression hardened. "I didn't come back to the desert to watch American tankers die because someone in Washington preferred comfortable assumptions to hard facts." The room fell silent, each man contemplating the implications. Sullivan had just explicitly stated that their mission might put them at odds with official doctrine, a position that could end careers if handled improperly. Rodriguez broke the tension with a characteristic snort. "Wouldn't be the first time we pissed off the brass, sir." As the meeting dispersed, Doc remained behind. "You know this could be your last command if you rock the boat too hard." Sullivan gathered his maps, taking a moment before responding. "When my father commanded tanks in World War II, he wrote home about German Panthers that outgunned his Shermans. His superiors insisted American tanks were superior despite losing crews daily. He carried that weight for the rest of his life." He looked up at his old friend. "I won't make the same mistake. If our tanks or tactics need changing, I'll say so, whatever it costs me." Doc nodded, understanding completely. The Sullivan family tradition. Stubbornness in the face of stupidity. The ground war began with overwhelming force. Coalition armies smashing through Iraqi defenses with a speed that surprised even the operations planners. Black Iron moved with the advance, Sullivan commanding from an M1 Abrams modified with additional communications equipment. Their first opportunity came 36 hours into the offensive, when reports arrived of abandoned T-72s near a Republican Guard position overwhelmed by airstrikes. Sullivan led a team to secure the site before combat engineers could destroy the equipment. What they found changed the course of the war. The T-72s weren't the export models American intelligence had studied for years. They featured advanced reactive armor, improved fire control systems, and engine modifications that significantly enhanced performance. "This changes everything," Rodriguez said as he examined an intact turret. "These aren't the tanks we prepared for." Sullivan ordered comprehensive documentation, with components removed for detailed analysis. Working through the night, his team produced preliminary reports that were transmitted directly to forward tank commanders, providing critical adjustments to engagement tactics. The most significant discovery came 3 days into the ground campaign, when Black Iron secured a command variant of the T-72 with its technical documentation intact. Thompson's intelligence team found evidence that Iraq had received not just Soviet tanks, but enhanced variants with capabilities that exceeded American estimates. Sullivan immediately requested a secure call with the theater commander, bypassing standard channels to ensure the information reached decision-makers immediately. The conversation was brief but consequential, resulting in tactical adjustments for all armored units engaging Republican Guard formations. The results became evident within hours. American tank commanders, now aware of the T-72's actual capabilities and vulnerabilities, adjusted their engagement distances and targeting priorities. The casualty projections for armored units dropped dramatically. Black Iron continued its work throughout the 100-hour ground war, capturing and analyzing 17 T-72 variants. Their findings revolutionized American understanding of Soviet tank design, identifying both strengths and critical weaknesses that previous intelligence had missed. The mission culminated in the aftermath of the Highway of Death, where coalition forces devastated retreating Iraqi columns. Among the destruction, Black Iron recovered key components from the most advanced T-72s yet encountered, confirming Sullivan's long-held theories about Soviet armor evolution. As the war concluded, Sullivan prepared his final report, documenting in extensive detail the discrepancies between pre-war intelligence and the reality discovered on the battlefield. The report included specific recommendations for adjustments to American tank design and combat doctrine based on actual performance data rather than theoretical models. Before submitting the document, Sullivan gathered his original crew, Doc, Rodriguez, and Thompson. These men had followed him from Vietnam to the desert, their collective experience representing over a century of armored warfare expertise. "This report will make waves," Sullivan told them, pushing the document across the table. "I want your names on it only if you're willing to accept the consequences. This challenges fundamental assumptions about our armor program. People have built entire careers on those assumptions." The three men exchanged glances before Doc reached for a pen, signing without hesitation. "Been following you in a fire for 20 years, Jack. No reason to stop now." Rodriguez and Thompson added their signatures, completing the circle that had begun in the jungles of Vietnam. Whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced everything together. The report, officially titled T-72 Variant Capabilities and Tactical Implications, became known informally as the Sullivan Assessment. Its immediate impact was restricted by classification, but its influence spread throughout the armored warfare community, driving modifications to training and tactics. Sullivan received both commendation and criticism. Some senior officers praised his initiative and the lives saved by his team's discoveries. Others viewed the report as an implicit criticism of pre-war intelligence failures, creating institutional resentment. The most significant backlash came from defense contractors whose tank design proposals were undermined by the Sullivan Assessment's findings. These companies had invested heavily in systems that the report suggested were based on flawed assumptions about enemy capabilities. In the months following Desert Storm, Sullivan found himself increasingly marginalized within the Pentagon, assigned to administrative roles that limited his influence. The message was clear: his technical expertise was valued, but his willingness to challenge conventional wisdom was not. The experience hardened his resolve to advocate for tank doctrine based on battlefield reality rather than theoretical models or procurement politics. This stance would define the remainder of his career and eventually lead to his retirement and the establishment of his training academy. Throughout these professional challenges, Sullivan's personal life faced its own trials. His extended deployment during Desert Storm and the classified nature of his work created additional distance between him and his family. Elizabeth supported him unwaveringly, understanding the importance of his mission. Tom, however, entered adolescence with a father who seemed more committed to his tanks than to family life. When Sullivan finally returned home permanently, he found a son who had grown increasingly independent, developing interests that diverged sharply from the military tradition Sullivan had assumed would continue. Their conversations became stilted, focusing on surface topics rather than meaningful connection. The final breaking point came when Tom announced his intention to attend the Air Force Academy rather than West Point, choosing to become a pilot rather than follow his father into the armored divisions. Why? Sullivan had demanded, more hurt than angry. 4 generations of Sullivans have served in tanks. Tom's response cut deeper than any combat wound. Because I want to fly above the battlefield, not be trapped inside a metal box like you and Grandpa. I want to see the sky. The rift widened over the years, even as Tom eventually left the Air Force to work in the defense industry. Their shared military experience should have created common ground, but instead highlighted their fundamental differences. Elizabeth's death from cancer in 2010 removed the bridge between father and son, leaving them to navigate their relationship without her mediating influence. They maintained contact but rarely connected on any meaningful level. Now standing in his academy office with Tom preparing to leave, Sullivan felt the weight of those decades of distance. The thumb drive in his pocket represented more than just evidence of Arjun's plans. It was a gesture from son to father, an offering that transcended their differences. "Tom," Sullivan called as his son reached the door. "Thank you for the warning and for the risk you're taking." Tom paused, his back still turned. "You taught me that some principles aren't negotiable. Even when we disagreed on everything else, I never questioned that." As the door closed behind his son, Sullivan turned to the photograph on his desk, his father standing beside a Sherman tank in Germany, 1945. The image of 3 generations of Sullivan men connected by steel and sacrifice. "Still fighting the same battles, Dad," he murmured to the photo. "Just different battlefields." Sullivan squared his shoulders and returned to the training field, where young men and women prepared for conflicts yet to come. The battle for his academy and legacy now loomed before him, requiring different tactics than those that had served him in combat. But the fundamental principles remained unchanged. Protect your people, tell the truth regardless of consequences, and never concede ground without a fight. The Sullivan family traditions, passed down through generations of tank commanders, would serve him one more time. As afternoon sunlight gleamed off the metal hulls of his training tanks, Sullivan felt a familiar determination rising within him. At 75, he had survived 3 wars and countless bureaucratic battles. This new challenge was just another engagement, another opportunity to prove that experience and principle still mattered in a world increasingly dominated by technology and expediency. Iron Jack Sullivan had never backed down from a fight. He wouldn't start now. The desert had been both salvation and torment for James Sullivan. Under its unforgiving sun, he had commanded steel giants across the sands of Iraq, achieving the most decisive tank victory in modern military history. Now, 3 decades later, that same Texas sun beat down on him as he waited outside his office for Dr. Sarah Mitchell to arrive. Tom had arranged the meeting exactly as promised. 1400 hours. Sullivan checked his watch. The historian was 7 minutes late, a detail that still irritated his military sensibilities despite the years of civilian life. A dust cloud appeared on the horizon, a vehicle approaching his academy along the lone access road. Sullivan straightened his posture instinctively, still carrying himself with the bearing of the colonel he once was. The SUV that arrived wasn't his son's government vehicle, but a civilian rental. A woman emerged, early 40s, with practical clothes and hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She carried a leather satchel that looked weathered from years of use, not what Sullivan had expected from a war college academic. "Dr. Mitchell," he greeted her as she approached. "You're late." She didn't flinch at his directness. "Road construction outside of Austin. And please, call me Sarah." Her handshake was firm, confident. "It's an honor to meet you, Colonel Sullivan. Your exploits during Desert Storm are legendary among military historians." "Most of what I did in Desert Storm isn't in the history books, Doctor." A smile touched the corners of her mouth. "That's precisely why I'm here." Tom's vehicle appeared then, arriving with military punctuality. He nodded to Sullivan and Dr. Mitchell as he joined them, carrying a leather portfolio that Sullivan recognized as having belonged to Elizabeth. It was the type of detail that revealed the complicated layers of their relationship. Tom had kept his mother's things, carrying her memory into his corporate world. "Shall we?" Tom gestured toward Sullivan's office. Inside, with the door closed against the desert heat and curious ears, Sullivan studied Dr. Mitchell more carefully. Her credentials were impressive. PhD from Georgetown, 10 years at the War College, author of 3 books on modern armored warfare. Yet she carried herself more like an operator than an academic. Your son tells me you're facing some troubles with Argent Defense, she began without preamble. They want my land and to shut down my academy. Mitchell nodded, opening her satchel to remove a digital recorder. May I, for accuracy? When Sullivan nodded, she placed it on the desk between them. Colonel, I've been researching black iron for my new book on revolutionary tank warfare tactics. The Pentagon is declassifying those operations next month, but the details remain sparse in official records. For good reason, Sullivan replied. Most of what we did violated technical agreements with the Soviets about weapons examination. You captured and reverse-engineered T-72s, Mitchell stated, and discovered modifications that contradicted official intelligence assessments. Sullivan exchanged a glance with Tom, surprised by the historian's knowledge. That's classified information, Doctor. Or it was until recently. I have sources, she said simply. Former tankers who served under you. Pentagon analysts who saw your reports. They all tell the same story. Black iron saved lives by challenging conventional wisdom about Soviet tank capabilities. And made powerful enemies in the process, Tom added. Mitchell turned to face the younger Sullivan. Including Argent's current CEO, Maxwell Porter. He was a junior Pentagon analyst whose tank vulnerability assessment was directly contradicted by your father's findings. This was new information to Sullivan. Porter? I remember him. Desk warrior with an engineering degree and no field experience. Insisted the T-72's autoloader couldn't be modified to handle larger rounds. The same, Mitchell confirmed. After Desert Storm, he left the Pentagon for the private sector. Climbed through the ranks at various defense contractors before landing at Argent 5 years ago. Under his leadership, they've become the primary developer of autonomous tank systems. Sullivan absorbed this, pieces falling into place. So this is personal. He's still carrying a grudge after 30 years. It appears so, but it's also business. Your training methods directly contradict Argent's claims that human operators are obsolete in modern tank warfare. Tom opened the portfolio, removing several documents. I've been tracking Argent's activities since I realized they were behind Westfield development. They've been systematically acquiring properties around major military installations, particularly those used for tank training. He spread a map across Sullivan's desk, showing property acquisitions highlighted in red. The pattern was unmistakable, forming a ring around key armored warfare training grounds. They're creating a buffer zone, Sullivan observed, his tactical mind immediately recognizing the strategy. Controlling access to training areas, making the military dependent on their facilities. And their technologies, Mitchell added. If traditional training space is limited, their autonomous systems become more attractive. They're creating artificial scarcity. Sullivan felt a familiar sensation rising within him, the clarity that came before battle, when objectives and obstacles became sharply defined. This wasn't just about his academy, it was about the future of tank warfare itself. We need to know exactly what they're planning, he said, his voice taking on the command tone that had directed men through 3 wars. Tom, what did you find on that drive? His son pulled out a laptop, inserting the thumb drive he'd provided earlier. Internal communications, mostly. Technical specifications for their new autonomous tank system. In this, he opened a document titled Human Factor Elimination Initiative. The contents revealed a systematic campaign to discredit traditional tank doctrine, specifically targeting Sullivan's methods and the academy he had built after retirement. They've been planting stories in military publications, Tom explained, questioning the relevance of experienced tank commanders in an age of AI and advanced targeting systems. Some of the articles mention you by name, calling your methods dangerously outdated. Sullivan felt his jaw tighten. He had faced criticism throughout his career, but this was different. This was a coordinated attack on principles that had saved countless lives. There's more, Tom continued, opening another file. They're lobbying Congress to redirect training funds away from traditional methods toward autonomous systems development, claiming a 40% reduction in casualties based on simulations. Simulations, Sullivan scoffed. No simulation captures the reality of tank combat, the chaos, the mechanical failures, the human decisions that determine who lives and dies. Mitchell leaned forward, her historian's curiosity evident. That's why your academy has been so successful, isn't it? You teach the intangibles that can't be programmed. Sullivan nodded, gesturing toward the window where his students continued working on the tanks outside. Those kids aren't learning to be machine operators. They're learning to be tank commanders. There's a world of difference. The conversation continued as they explored Argent's strategy and potential countermeasures. Mitchell's historical perspective proved valuable, identifying patterns from past conflicts between traditional military doctrine and technological innovation. This isn't the first time technology advocates have declared human judgment obsolete, she observed. After World War I, theorists claimed aircraft would make ground forces irrelevant. After nuclear weapons, conventional warfare was supposedly finished. Every time, the human element reasserted its importance. As the meeting progressed, Sullivan found himself drawn to Mitchell's analytical mind and straightforward manner. She reminded him of Elizabeth in some ways, possessing that rare combination of intellectual rigor and practical understanding that his late wife had embodied. The sun was setting when they finally exhausted their immediate plans. Tom needed to return to Washington, where he would continue monitoring Argent's activities from inside the defense industry. Mitchell would accelerate her research on black iron, preparing to publish findings that would highlight the critical importance of Sullivan's methods. As for Sullivan himself, he would continue training his students, documenting his techniques, and preparing for the legal battle over his academy's land. 30 days isn't much time, Tom said as they concluded. Argent has the legal advantage with that environmental clause. Then we'll need to change the battlefield, Sullivan replied, the strategist in him already mapping alternative approaches. Dr. Mitchell, how quickly can you get your research into publication? Call me Sarah, please. And with what I've already gathered, I could have preliminary findings ready within 2 weeks, not the complete book, but enough to establish the historical significance of your methods and black iron's contributions. Sullivan nodded, satisfied. That might be enough to file for historical preservation status. Tom, can you get me a meeting with General Harwick at the Pentagon? He commands the Armor Training Division now, and he served under me during Desert Storm. I'll try, but Porter has influence with the current administration. He's donated heavily to several key congressional committees overseeing military appropriations. Politics, Sullivan growled, always complicating simple matters. As they prepared to leave, Mitchell paused by the wall of photographs in Sullivan's office, studying the images of tank crews from Vietnam through Desert Storm. These men trusted you with their lives, she said quietly. What would you tell them about this fight? Sullivan considered the question, looking at the faces of soldiers long since scattered by time and circumstance. The same thing I told them before every mission. Know your vehicle, know your enemy, and never forget that steel can be replaced. Crews cannot. After Tom and Mitchell departed, Sullivan remained in his office, reviewing the information they had shared. The scope of Argent's campaign against traditional tank warfare was broader than he had imagined, extending beyond simple land acquisition into a fundamental reshaping of military doctrine. He pulled out the metal tankard his father had carried through World War II, running his thumb across the worn surface. 4 generations of Sullivan men had served in tanks, witnessing the evolution of armored warfare from its earliest days. Now that legacy faced its greatest challenge, not from enemy fire, but from boardrooms and budget committees. The ringing of his phone interrupted his thoughts. The caller ID showed Doc Williams, his oldest friend and former gunner, now retired in Colorado. Jack, Doc's voice came through with the same steady calm that had anchored Sullivan through countless battles. Just checking if we're still on for the reunion next month. Sullivan had almost forgotten the planned gathering of black iron veterans, scheduled for the 30th anniversary of Desert Storm. Might be complicated, Doc. I'm in a situation here. What kind of situation? The immediate shift in Doc's tone revealed a soldier still present beneath the retired exterior. Sullivan explained the circumstances with Argent, Porter's apparent vendetta, and the threat to his academy. Doc listened without interruption, absorbing the details with the same focused attention he had once given to targeting information in combat. So Porter's trying to erase what we did, Doc finally said, rewrite history to make his toys look better. That's the shape of it. A brief silence followed before Doc spoke again, his voice hardened with resolve. The boys need to know, Jack. Rodriguez, Thompson, all of them. This isn't just your fight, it's ours too. I can't ask them to risk their reputations, Doc. Most of them have consulting contracts with defense firms. Getting crosswise with Argent could cost them. Doc's laugh carried the gravel of age and cigarettes. You think any of us give a damn about that? We followed you into Iraqi tank formations when the odds said we shouldn't come back. You think a bunch of corporate suits scare us now? The loyalty humbled Sullivan, reminding him of the bond formed in combat that no civilian experience could replicate or truly understand. All right, make the calls. but tell them what they're getting into. Will do, and Jack, don't start the war without us. After hanging up, Sullivan stepped outside into the Texas night, the stars brilliant above the flat landscape. His students had retired to their barracks, the training vehicles sitting silent under floodlights. In the stillness, he could almost hear the rumble of engines from decades past, the crackle of radio communications, the metallic sound of rounds being loaded. The memories transported him back to 91, to the height of his command during Operation Desert Storm. The morning of the ground war's commencement found Sullivan standing in the turret of his command tank, binoculars trained on the horizon where Iraqi positions waited behind hastily constructed berms and trenches. The airstrikes had been relentless for weeks, but aerial reconnaissance indicated that significant armored forces remained intact, particularly the elite Republican Guard divisions equipped with the latest Soviet tanks. All black iron elements. This is Anvil Actual, Sullivan spoke into his radio, using the call sign assigned to their specialized unit. Final checks complete. We move in 5 minutes directly behind the main assault elements. Our mission is capture, not destruction. Prioritize disabled but intact enemy armor. Interrogation teams will deploy on my signal. Acknowledgements came from the 4 specialized platoons under his command. Each had been configured for specific aspects of the mission: security, recovery, technical assessment, and transportation. Unlike standard tank battalions focused on enemy destruction, Black Iron's success would be measured by the intelligence they gathered. Anvil 2, status? Sullivan called to Doc Williams, who commanded the recovery elements. Ready to roll, Anvil Actual. Recovery vehicles fueled and equipped, technical teams standing by. Sullivan scanned the horizon one last time before dropping down into the commander's position of his modified Abrams. The interior smelled of metal, electronics, and the distinctive odor of men prepared for combat, a mixture of nervous sweat and gun oil that no amount of ventilation could eliminate. "Driver, advance," he ordered, and the massive tank lurched forward, leading the Black Iron formation toward the Iraqi border. The initial breakthrough occurred with stunning speed. Coalition forces smashed through frontline Iraqi positions, many of which surrendered without significant resistance. The air campaign had done its work, destroying command structures and demoralizing frontline troops. For Sullivan and Black Iron, however, the real mission would begin only when they reached the secondary defensive lines, where the Republican Guard waited with their Soviet-supplied tanks. These elite units had been held in reserve, protected from the worst of the air campaign, and intelligence suggested they would offer substantial resistance. 18 hours into the ground war, Sullivan received the first opportunity to fulfill Black Iron's purpose. Reports came through of an Iraqi armored company that had been engaged and partially disabled by airstrikes, with several T-72s apparently abandoned by their crews, but still largely intact. "Anvil elements, converge on my position," Sullivan ordered, directing his tank toward the coordinates. Security teams established perimeter. Recovery teams stand by. They found 3 T-72s in various states of damage, positioned in defensive hull down positions behind a low ridgeline. The tanks showed evidence of air attack but had not burned, suggesting their crews had abandoned them before catastrophic damage occurred. Sullivan deployed his forces methodically, securing the area while technical teams approached the disabled vehicles. The danger was significant. Booby traps were a standard Iraqi tactic, and the tanks themselves might still contain ammunition that could cook off if handled improperly. "Approach with extreme caution," Sullivan directed the recovery teams, full EOD protocols in effect. He observed from his command position as specialists in explosive ordnance disposal swept each tank for traps before technical teams began their assessment. The process was painstaking but necessary, balancing the urgent need for intelligence against the safety of his personnel. Rodriguez led the primary technical team, his decades of experience with tank mechanics making him the natural choice for initial evaluation. Sullivan watched through binoculars as his old friend methodically examined the first T-72, starting with external features before carefully entering through the commander's hatch. "Anvil Actual, this is Tech 1, Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio after 20 minutes of examination. "You're going to want to see this personally, sir." Sullivan transferred command to Doc and made his way to the captured tank. Rodriguez emerged from the turret as he approached, his expression a mixture of professional excitement and concern. "What have you found, Sergeant Major?" Rodriguez wiped his hands on a rag, leaving dark streaks of grease. "Not what we expected, sir. This isn't a standard export model T-72. The armor configuration is different, particularly around the turret face, and the autoloader has been modified, just like you theorized. Sullivan climbed onto the tank, examining the exterior before lowering himself into the commander's position. The interior was cramped compared to American tanks, reflecting Soviet design philosophy that prioritized low profile over crew comfort. The modifications became immediately apparent to his experienced eye. The fire control system had been upgraded beyond what intelligence reports had indicated. The autoloader showed signs of adaptation to handle larger rounds than the standard 125mm ammunition. Most significantly, the armor composition appeared to incorporate elements of reactive armor in configurations not previously documented in export T-72s. This would substantially change the vulnerability profile that American tankers had been trained to target. "Document everything," Sullivan ordered as he emerged. "I want detailed photographs, measurements, and samples of the armor composition, and check the other vehicles to see if they show the same modifications." The next 8 hours were a frenzy of activity as Black Iron extracted critical components and gathered intelligence from the captured tanks. Sullivan established secure communications with forward American tank units, providing immediate updates on the new threat profiles they might encounter. "Target the lower front plate at angles less than 20 degrees, he instructed commanders preparing to engage Republican Guard formations. "The reactive armor configuration makes standard turret shots less effective than our doctrine suggests." This pattern repeated throughout the ground campaign. Black Iron following in the wake of the main assault forces, securing and analyzing disabled Iraqi armor, then rapidly disseminating findings to combat elements. Their work directly influenced engagement tactics, potentially saving numerous American tank crews from discovering Iraqi capabilities the hard way. The most significant discovery came on the third day of the ground war, when Black Iron located an abandoned command variant of the T-72 with intact documentation. Thompson's intelligence team worked through the night translating technical manuals and tactical guides, revealing capabilities that contradicted years of Western intelligence assessments. "They've been systematically upgrading these tanks with technology we didn't think they had access to," Thompson reported to Sullivan during their morning briefing. "Some components appear to be of Soviet origin, but others show signs of indigenous modification or possibly Chinese influence." Sullivan immediately recognized the implications. "Our engagement doctrine is based on vulnerability profiles that may no longer apply. We need to get this information to every tank commander in theater immediately." He arranged an emergency secure call with the theater commander, bypassing standard protocols to ensure the information reached decision-makers without bureaucratic delay. The conversation was brief but consequential. "General, our analysis indicates that frontline Republican Guard tanks have protection levels approximately 30% higher than our current tactical guidance accounts for. We're transmitting modified engagement parameters now, but all tank commanders should be advised to adjust their tactics accordingly." The general's response was equally direct. "Understood, Colonel. Disseminate your findings through all channels. I want every tank commander in theater updated before they engage the Republican Guard." The impact of Black Iron's intelligence became evident within hours, as the first major tank battles between American forces and the Republican Guard unfolded. Tank commanders who had received Sullivan's updated guidance adjusted their targeting and engagement ranges, neutralizing the advantage the modified T-72s might otherwise have enjoyed. The culmination of Sullivan's mission came during the massive tank battles along the Highway of Death, where retreating Iraqi forces, including significant Republican Guard elements, were caught in devastating coalition air and ground attacks. In the aftermath, Black Iron recovered components from the most advanced T-72 variants yet encountered, confirming Sullivan's theories about Soviet armor evolution. As the ground war drew to its rapid conclusion, Sullivan compiled his findings into a comprehensive report documenting the discrepancies between pre-war intelligence and the reality discovered on the battlefield. The document included specific recommendations for adjustments to American tank design and combat doctrine, supported by extensive technical data gathered from captured vehicles. The immediate impact of the report was limited by classification restrictions, but its influence spread through the armored warfare community, driving modifications to training and equipment. For Sullivan personally, however, the report had mixed consequences, simultaneously enhancing his reputation as a technical expert while creating political challenges with those whose assessments he had contradicted. In the years that followed Desert Storm, Sullivan continued to advocate for tank doctrine based on battlefield reality, rather than theoretical models or procurement politics. This position increasingly placed him at odds with defense contractors and Pentagon officials who favored technological solutions over experience-based approaches. The most significant conflict emerged around the development of the next generation of the M1 Abrams, when Sullivan publicly criticized design elements that prioritize complex electronic systems over proven mechanical reliability. His position was based directly on lessons from Desert Storm, where simpler systems had proven more resilient in combat conditions. Tanks don't fight in laboratories, he testified before a congressional committee reviewing the program. They fight in dust, extreme temperatures, and electromagnetic environments that degrade fancy electronics. Our designs need to account for worst-case conditions, not ideal ones. His testimony directly challenged claims made by several defense contractors, including earlier incarnations of what would eventually become Argent Defense Systems. The companies had invested heavily in electronic warfare suites and automated targeting systems that Sullivan's experience suggested would fail under actual combat conditions. The resulting backlash was subtle but effective. Sullivan found himself gradually marginalized within Pentagon planning circles, his expertise acknowledged, but his influence diminished. Younger officers who embraced the technological focus advanced more rapidly, while Sullivan's career plateaued despite his combat record. These professional frustrations coincided with personal challenges, as Sullivan struggled to maintain connections with his family during repeated deployments and in training assignments. Elizabeth provided unwavering support, but Tom entered adolescence increasingly distant from his frequently absent father. Sullivan's final command came in the late 1990s, overseeing tank training programs at Fort Hood. Even in this role, he found himself fighting bureaucratic battles to maintain traditional skills, training against budget pressures that favored simulator time over actual vehicle operation. When retirement finally came in 2001, Sullivan faced it with mixed emotions. The professional soldier in him resisted stepping away from the institution that had defined his life for over 3 decades. Yet he also recognized that the Army was evolving in directions increasingly at odds with his experience-based philosophy. Elizabeth suggested the training academy as a way to preserve and share his knowledge. The idea took root quickly, with Sullivan investing his retirement savings in purchasing land and decommissioned tanks for instruction. Former colleagues, many similarly disillusioned with the military's direction, joined as instructors or provided connections to potential students. The academy flourished in its early years, attracting young officers seeking supplemental training beyond standard military courses, as well as international students from allied nations. Sullivan's reputation drew them, but his methods kept them engaged. Hands-on instruction, emphasizing practical skills over theory, mechanical understanding over electronic dependence. When the Iraq War began in 2003, demand for Sullivan's training surged as newly commissioned officers sought every advantage before deployment. He modeled scenarios directly on his Desert Storm experiences, creating realistic conditions that standard military training often sanitized. The difference between Sullivan's academy and regular training is simple, one student wrote in a military journal. The Army teaches you how tanks are supposed to work. Sullivan teaches you what to do when they don't. This practical approach proved its value that reports filtered back from Iraq, where conditions often matched Sullivan's worst-case scenarios: dust clogging, sensitive electronics, heat affecting targeting systems, maintenance challenges in forward positions. Officers who had trained under Sullivan reported greater readiness for these realities than those who had not. The Academy's success brought renewed attention from both military circles and defense contractors. The former increasingly sent observers to study Sullivan's methods, while the latter viewed his training as an implicit criticism of their technology-focused approach. Among those contractors, the newly formed Argent Defense Systems emerged as particularly hostile to Sullivan's philosophy. Under the leadership of former Pentagon analyst Maxwell Porter, Argent aggressively marketed autonomous vehicle systems as the future of armored warfare, directly contradicting Sullivan's emphasis on human judgment and mechanical reliability. The conflict remained largely professional until Elizabeth's diagnosis in 2009. Cancer moved swiftly, leaving Sullivan adrift without the partner who had balanced his military rigidity with compassion and perspective. In his grief, the Academy became both refuge and purpose, absorbing energy he might otherwise have directed toward rebuilding connections with Tom. By 2020, the philosophical divide between Sullivan's approach and the mainstream military establishment had widened further. The Pentagon increasingly embraced autonomous systems and artificial intelligence, reducing the human element in combat decisions. Sullivan's Academy stood as one of the few institutions still championing experience-based training for tank commanders. Then came the first indirect attack. A series of articles in military publications questioned the relevance of old-school tank tactics in modern warfare, specifically citing Sullivan's methods as dangerously outdated and nostalgic rather than practical. The pieces carried different bylines but shared a common perspective that Sullivan immediately recognized as coordinated. "They're trying to discredit you before discrediting your methods," Doc Williams observed during one of his visits to the academy. "Classic psyops, undermine the messenger to weaken the message." Sullivan weathered the criticism stoically, continuing his training program while responding through the same military journals with evidence-based defenses of traditional tank doctrine. His articles cited actual combat outcomes rather than theoretical models, drawing on both his Vietnam and Desert Storm experiences to illustrate the enduring importance of human judgment in armored warfare. The next phase of attack came through regulatory channels. Anonymous complaints triggered environmental inspections of the Academy's training grounds, citing concerns about soil contamination from aging tank components. Sullivan complied with all requirements, implementing remediation measures where necessary, but the pattern was clear: systematic pressure applied through multiple vectors. Throughout these challenges, Sullivan maintained contact with his original Black Iron team. Doc Williams visited regularly, while Rodriguez and Thompson kept in touch through calls and occasional reunions. These men understood, as few others could, the importance of preserving the knowledge and methods that had saved lives during Desert Storm. Their support sustained Sullivan during the increasingly aggressive campaign against his academy. When financial pressures mounted due to legal fees from regulatory challenges, his old crew helped arrange private funding through contacts in the veteran community. When media attacks intensified, they provided counter-narratives based on their own combat experiences. This solidarity reflected a truth that Sullivan had learned in Vietnam and confirmed in every subsequent conflict. The bond between tank crews transcended time and circumstance. Men who had faced death together inside armored vehicles developed connections that civilian life could neither replicate nor fully understand. Now, as he stood under the Texas stars contemplating Argent's latest move against his academy, Sullivan felt that connection extending across decades in battlefields. Doc was mobilizing the old crew, veterans gathering for one more mission. The battlefield had changed from desert sands to corporate boardrooms and legal filings, but the core principles remained: protect your people, accomplish the mission, adapt to overcome. Sullivan's phone vibrated with an incoming message. A text from Sarah Mitchell. Found additional documents on Black Iron operations. Game-changing information. Meeting tomorrow. He sent a brief affirmative reply, then continued his walk around the perimeter of the training ground. The tanks sat silently in the moonlight, their silhouettes familiar and somehow comforting. Each represented countless hours of instruction, young officers learning lessons that might someday save their lives or those of their crews. The thought of losing this place, of seeing his life's work dismantled to make way for corporate development, stirred a determination in Sullivan that he had not felt since combat. This was not merely a business matter or a legal dispute. It was an existential threat to principles that had defined his existence and a legacy that stretched back generations. As he completed his circuit and turned toward his quarters, Sullivan's mind shifted from reflection to planning. The tactical approach was becoming clear. Gather intelligence, mobilize resources, identify the enemy's vulnerabilities, and strike decisively. Not with weapons this time, but with truth, experience, and the collective wisdom of men who had proven their worth in the crucible of combat. The following morning brought Sarah Mitchell back to the academy, arriving precisely at the agreed time. Her expression as she entered Sullivan's office suggested significant discoveries. "I've been through the preliminary declassified files," she said without preamble, placing her laptop on his desk. "The Pentagon is releasing more than I expected about Black Iron, including your original T-72 assessment reports. But there are conspicuous omissions." Sullivan leaned forward. "What kind of omissions?" "References to your specific tactical recommendations. The technical data is being released, but not the operational guidance you provided to tank commanders during the ground war." This was concerning, but not surprising. The operational aspects had been the most politically sensitive, directly contradicting pre-war doctrine developed by officers who had subsequently risen to senior positions. The good news, Mitchell continued, is that I've located several tank commanders who received your guidance during Desert Storm. They've agreed to provide statements about how your tactical adjustments impacted their operations. Combined with the technical data being declassified, it creates a compelling historical record. Enough for historical preservation status? Mitchell's expression turned cautious. Potentially, but we'll need more than historical significance. Argent's environmental claims provide legal leverage that history alone may not overcome. Sullivan nodded, understanding the challenge. Environmental regulations carried significant weight in property disputes, often superseding historical or cultural considerations. There's something else, Mitchell added, her tone shifting. While researching black iron, I discovered connections to another classified program called Iron Warrior. It was a tank development initiative in the mid-1990s, focusing on crew survivability improvements based directly on your Desert Storm findings. Sullivan straightened, memory surfacing. Iron Warrior, I consulted on the early stages before it was canceled. The program integrated certain features I recommended based on the T-72 assessments, improved crew extraction systems, redesigned ammunition storage to reduce catastrophic detonation risk. Good ideas killed by budget cuts. Not just budget cuts, Mitchell corrected, turning her laptop to show Sullivan a document. According to these records, the program was redirected, not terminated. Funding was shifted toward autonomous systems research, the precursor to Argent's current projects. And guess who recommended the redirection? The document showed the signature of Maxwell Porter, then a senior Pentagon analyst, on a recommendation to terminate Iron Warrior in favor of unmanned alternatives. Porter killed Iron Warrior to promote his pet projects, Sullivan said, the pieces connecting. Systems that emphasize technology over crew survival. And now he's running a company built on that same philosophy. Exactly, and here's why it matters now. Mitchell opened another document, a technical assessment from recent Afghanistan operations. 3 years ago, an Abrams was hit by an IED that should have been survivable according to design specifications. The crew was lost because the very systems Iron Warrior would have improved failed under combat conditions. The implications struck Sullivan like a physical blow. Porter's decision to redirect funding away from crew survivability improvements may have directly contributed to American casualties. If this connection could be established publicly, it would fundamentally change the narrative surrounding Argent's autonomous tank initiative. We need to verify this conclusively, Sullivan said, military caution tempering his reaction. Correlation isn't causation, especially with combat incidents. Were there official investigations? Classified, but I have sources working to access them. Mitchell's determination matched his own. If we can establish this link, it transforms the debate from historical preservation to current safety implications. That's much harder for Argent to dismiss. Sullivan nodded, recognizing both the potential and the risks of this approach. Porter will fight back hard if we go this route. He has political connections, and questioning military procurement decisions touches sensitive nerves in Washington. I'm aware of the risks, Mitchell replied, but some truths need to be told, regardless of who they offend. Isn't that what Black Iron was ultimately about? Truth over comfortable assumptions? The parallel was apt, drawing a direct line from Sullivan's Desert Storm mission to the current conflict. In both cases, the fundamental issue was the same: lives at stake because of decisions made far from the battlefield by people insulated from consequences. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Tom, who entered without knocking, his expression urgent. We have a problem. Argent has accelerated their timeline. They're filing for immediate possession tomorrow, citing emergency environmental remediation requirements. Sullivan absorbed this with outward calm, though internally he recognized the tactical significance. They're pressing the advantage, moving before we can organize our defense. It gets worse, Tom continued. They've somehow obtained affidavits from 2 former students claiming they observed improper disposal of hazardous materials here. The allegations would trigger automatic suspension of operations pending investigation. False claims, Sullivan stated flatly. We've followed every regulation to the letter. Truth isn't the point. The process is the punishment. Even if you're eventually cleared, the investigation would shut down the academy for months. Mitchell closed her laptop, mind working visibly. We need to change the battlefield. like you said yesterday. Take this fight public before they can bury it in regulatory proceedings. How? Tom asked. Argent has relationships with every major defense publication. They'll control the narrative in traditional channels. Sullivan's phone vibrated with an incoming call. The screen showed Doc Williams' name. Hold that thought, he said, answering. Doc, what's your status? Better than expected, his old friend replied, voice carrying the satisfaction of a successful mission. Rodriguez, Thompson, and 15 other Black Iron veterans are converging on your position. ETA tomorrow morning, and we're bringing something special. What kind of special? Doc's chuckle carried decades of shared experiences. Let's just say some of us kept better records of Black Iron than the Pentagon did. Official documents have a way of disappearing. Personal journals don't. After ending the call, Sullivan explained the development to Tom and Mitchell. My old crew is inbound with additional documentation. Material that never made it into official records but could corroborate our findings. That helps with the historical angle, Tom acknowledged. But we still need to address the environmental claims quickly. Those affidavits will be difficult to counter without time-consuming testing and analysis. Sullivan considered the tactical situation, evaluating resources and vulnerabilities as he had countless times in combat. Dr. Mitchell, how quickly can you prepare a preliminary paper on the historical significance of the Academy and its connection to Black Iron? With what I already have, 24 hours for something substantive, not comprehensive, but enough to establish the initial case. Do it, Sullivan directed. Tom, I need you to research who's behind those environmental affidavits. Former students who suddenly turned against the Academy didn't do so in a vacuum. Someone approached them. On it. I still have contacts in the VA system who can help identify the individuals. Sullivan nodded, plans forming. Meanwhile, I'll prepare the Academy records for review. Full transparency on our environmental compliance, maintenance procedures, everything. We'll have it ready when Doc and the others arrive. As they dispersed to their respective tasks, Sullivan remained in his office, contemplating the battle ahead. Argent had chosen the field of engagement, environmental regulations, and legal proceedings. But Sullivan had spent a lifetime converting disadvantageous battlefield conditions to his favor. The key, as always, lay in understanding the true nature of the conflict. This wasn't fundamentally about land or environmental concerns. It was about competing visions for the future of armored warfare. Human judgment versus artificial intelligence, experience versus algorithms, crews versus computers. Sullivan began gathering the Academy's records, meticulously organized through years of military habit. As he worked, his mind continued mapping the coming campaign, identifying resources, vulnerabilities, and potential allies. The strategies of tank warfare translated surprisingly well to this new battlefield. Concentrate force at decisive points, protect vital assets, exploit enemy weaknesses. By evening, the initial preparations were complete. Sullivan had assembled comprehensive documentation of the Academy's environmental compliance. Tom had identified connections between the accusers and an Argent subsidiary, and Mitchell had begun drafting her historical assessment based on newly declassified materials. As darkness fell over the Texas landscape, Sullivan stepped outside once more, surveying the training grounds that had become his life's second act. The tanks stood silently under floodlights, their forms familiar and somehow reassuring despite the threat now looming over them. In the distance, heat lightning flickered across the horizon, nature's artillery illuminating clouds that resembled smoke from distant battles. Sullivan watched the display, feeling the weight of the coming conflict settling across his shoulders. This would not be like Vietnam, where victory proved elusive despite tactical successes. Nor would it resemble Desert Storm, with overwhelming force applied to clearly defined objectives. This new battle more closely resembled the Long Cold War. Ideological competition playing out across multiple domains, with principles rather than territory at stake. Sullivan's phone vibrated with a message from Rodriguez. Convoy assembled, rolling at dawn, ready for one more mission, Colonel. The simple text carried profound meaning, representing not just the arrival of reinforcements, but the reactivation of bonds forged in combat. These men had followed Sullivan into battle decades earlier, trusting his judgment when lives hung in the balance. Now they were coming again, believing in his cause when his legacy stood at risk. Sullivan sent a brief acknowledgement, then continued his solitary patrol around the Academy perimeter. In the morning, old comrades would arrive, bringing with them memories and evidence from battles long past. Together, they would face a different kind of enemy, one that threatened not their lives but the principles and methods that had preserved so many others. As he completed his circuit and turned toward his quarters, Sullivan's resolve hardened into certainty. Some fights transcended personal interest, becoming matters of principle that defined a man's existence. This was such a fight, connecting his past with whatever future remained to him. Tomorrow, Black Iron would ride again, not in desert sand, but in defense of truth. The weapons would be different, the battlefield unfamiliar, but the core mission unchanged. Save lives by ensuring that those who commanded tanks did so with proper training, proper understanding, and proper respect for both the machines and the men who operated them. In his Spartan quarters, Sullivan removed his father's tankard from its place of honor on his desk. The metal was worn smooth from decades of handling, carrying the fingerprints of 2 generations of tank commanders. Sullivan ran his thumb across the surface, feeling connection to both past and future. "One more mission," he murmured to the empty room, echoing Rodriguez's message. "One more time into the breach." Sleep came easily that night, as it often did before battle. Sullivan's last conscious thought was not of the legal challenges ahead or the corporate forces arrayed against him, but of young officers yet unborn who might someday command tanks in conflicts yet unimagined. These unknown soldiers were the true beneficiaries of his current fight, the inheritors of knowledge purchased with blood and preserved through stubborn insistence on truth over convenience. For them, Sullivan would face whatever came next, carrying forward a legacy of steel and sacrifice that had defined his family for generations. The battlefield had changed. The weapons evolved, but the fundamental principle remained constant. Some truths were worth fighting for, whatever the cost. Dawn broke over the Texas plains with military precision, the horizon glowing amber as Sullivan completed his morning inspection of the academy grounds. The routines of decades in uniform persisted in civilian life, a metronome that had kept him centered through wars and peace. Today, those habits provided stability as he prepared for a battle unlike any he had fought before. The distant rumble of engines drew his attention toward the access road. A convoy approached, not the military formations he once commanded, but civilian vehicles carrying men who had followed him into combat zones across 3 decades. Black Iron was coming home. Sullivan straightened his posture instinctively, the commander in him responding to the moment. The convoy consisted of pickup trucks, SUVs, and even a few motorcycles, vehicles as varied as the men who drove them. At the lead was a distinctive black Ford F-150 that Sullivan recognized immediately as belonging to Rodriguez. The trucks pulled into the academy's main yard, forming a loose semicircle in front of the main building. As engines cut and doors opened, Sullivan was struck by the sight of his old comrades. They had aged, hair grayed or vanished, bodies thickened or thinned, but something essential remained unchanged: the bearing of men who had faced death together and carried that knowledge through life. Doc Williams emerged from the passenger seat of Rodriguez's truck, moving with a slight limp that Sullivan knew came from a helicopter crash during training years after Vietnam. Despite this, Doc carried himself with the same steady purpose that had made him an exceptional tank gunner and later a respected officer. "Colonel," Doc said, saluting with an ironic smile that acknowledged both the formality and the decades of friendship that transcended rank. Sullivan returned the salute before accepting Doc's firm handshake that transformed into a brief embrace. "Major," he replied, using Doc's final rank with the same mixture of respect and familiarity. Rodriguez approached next, his broad grin unchanged despite the gray mustache that had replaced the dark one Sullivan remembered. "You started a war without us, Jack," he said, gripping Sullivan's shoulder with a hand still powerful from decades of mechanical work. "Just gathering intelligence," Sullivan replied. "Needed my best team for the main assault." The men laughed, tension breaking as old rhythms reasserted themselves. Thompson joined them, still lean and observant, his intelligence background evident in the way his eyes continuously scanned the environment, even in this reunion. Other veterans from Black Iron appeared from vehicles, some familiar, others known only by reputation or brief service under Sullivan's command. Each greeted him with the respect of soldiers for a commander they trusted, mixed with the ease of men who shared common experiences that civilians could never fully comprehend. The last vehicle in the convoy was an unmarked van that Sullivan didn't recognize. When its side door opened, 2 men emerged carrying large metal cases with military markings. "What's this?" Sullivan asked, looking to Doc for explanation. Insurance policy, Doc replied. Personal records, photographs, technical drawings, things that never made it into official reports, but tell the real story of Black Iron. Some of these guys kept everything, figuring someday the truth would need telling. Before Sullivan could respond, another vehicle appeared on the horizon, approaching rapidly. Tom's government SUV skidded slightly as it came to a stop beside the assembled veterans. They filed the papers, Tom announced without preamble as he approached the group. Westfield Development has an emergency injunction hearing scheduled for 1100 hours at the county courthouse. They're moving faster than we anticipated. Sullivan checked his watch. 3 hours. Barely enough time to review what his old crew had brought, let alone develop a comprehensive response. Then we better move faster, he said, commander's voice automatically engaging. Doc, get those records inside. Rodriguez, brief the team on what we're facing. Tom, call Mitchell and tell her to meet us at the courthouse. I'll prepare the environmental compliance documentation. The men dispersed to their tasks without question, the chain of command reasserting itself naturally despite the decades since they had served together officially. Sullivan watched with quiet pride as they moved with purpose, old soldiers adapting to a new mission. Inside his office, Sullivan and Doc began reviewing the materials the veterans had brought. The metal cases contained a historical treasure trove, handwritten journals documenting daily operations, photographs of captured Iraqi tanks with detailed annotations, technical drawings comparing Soviet design specifications with actual battlefield configurations, and personal correspondence between Sullivan and various tank commanders implementing his tactical adjustments. This is more than I expected, Sullivan said, examining a particularly detailed analysis of T-72 autoloader modifications that Rodriguez had documented in the field. We all knew what we were doing was important, Doc replied, and that the official record might not capture everything. Rodriguez was especially paranoid about it, kept duplicates of everything, distributed among trusted crew members. One folder contained something Sullivan hadn't seen in decades, the original handwritten drafts of his tactical guidance for engaging the modified T-72s. The margins contained notes from field commanders confirming successful implementations and reporting outcomes. These proved the direct impact of Black Iron's intelligence on combat operations, Sullivan observed, recognizing the potential significance for their current battle. And this might be even more valuable, Doc said, sliding a sealed envelope across the desk. Official after-action report from Major General Harwick following the engagement at 73 Easting specifically credits your tactical adjustments with preventing American casualties when they encountered upgraded T-72s. Sullivan examined the document carefully. This was classified. How did you get it? Harwick himself, Doc said with a smile. He's retired now, no longer bound by the same restrictions. Said to tell you he hasn't forgotten what Black Iron did, and he's ready to testify if needed. The mention of Harwick triggered a memory from Desert Storm. Then a colonel commanding a tank battalion, Harwick had initially resisted Sullivan's updated tactical guidance as contradicting established doctrine. After encountering the first modified T-72 in battle, he had radioed personally to acknowledge that Sullivan's intelligence had saved his crews. This changes our approach, Sullivan said, mind already recalibrating. We don't just have historical significance now. We have direct evidence that Black Iron's methods saved lives, and by extension, that the training we provide here continues that legacy. As they organized his materials for the courthouse hearing, Rodriguez entered with several of the veterans, each carrying additional documentation or prepared to provide testimony. We've got something else, Colonel, Rodriguez said, his expression suggesting significant news. 2 of our guys went through the Academy's training program last year as observers for their current employers. They conducted soil and water testing as part of their standard environmental compliance reviews. He placed a folder on Sullivan's desk. Comprehensive environmental assessment conducted by certified third-party specialists. Shows this facility exceeds all federal and state requirements. Directly contradicts Westfield's claims. Sullivan examined the reports, recognizing their potential value in countering the false allegations Argent had engineered. This is excellent work, Sergeant Major. There's more, Thompson added, stepping forward with his own folder. Intelligence assessment on Argent's autonomous tank program. Internal documents suggesting they've misrepresented test results to secure additional funding. The actual performance metrics show significantly higher failure rates than publicly reported. Sullivan raised an eyebrow. How did you obtain this? Thompson's expression remained professionally neutral. Some of us maintained active clearances and access to certain information channels. The documents are legitimate and legally obtained through proper whistleblower protocols. The tactical landscape was shifting rapidly, additional resources appearing from unexpected directions. Sullivan felt the familiar clarity that came in combat when initial plans evolved to incorporate new intelligence and opportunities. Tom, he called it his son, who was coordinating communications with Mitchell. We need to adjust our approach. The environmental angle is covered. We need to focus on the direct connection between Black Iron's findings, the Academy's training methods, and current crew safety issues. Tom nodded, understanding immediately. Shifting from defense to offense, Mitchell's research on the Iron Warrior program becomes central rather than supporting. Exactly. Tell her to bring everything she has on Porter's role in redirecting that funding, particularly any connections to current safety vulnerabilities. As the team continued preparations, Sullivan stepped outside briefly, needing a moment to process the rapid developments. The morning sun had fully risen now, illuminating the tanks on the training field. They stood as silent witnesses to history, embodiments of the principles he had spent a lifetime defending. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Rodriguez joined him, looking out at the assembled vehicles. "Brings back memories, doesn't it?" the older man said, gesturing toward the tanks. "Different war, same principles." Sullivan nodded, understanding completely. "Protect your people. Tell the truth about what you find. Make decisions based on reality, not theory." "That's why we're all here," Rodriguez said simply. "Those principles matter. They kept us alive then. They'll keep others alive now." The simplicity of the statement captured the essence of their cause, stripping away legal complexities and corporate maneuvering to reveal the core issue: human lives preserved through experience-based knowledge. Sullivan checked his watch again. Time to move out. The battle won't come to us this time. The convoy reassembled for the drive to the county courthouse, an unlikely armada of civilian vehicles carrying veterans whose combined combat experience represented over a century of American military history. Sullivan rode with Doc, Rodriguez, and Thompson, the original Black Iron Corps team reunited for perhaps their final mission. "Just like old times," Doc observed as they traveled, "except the air conditioning works, nobody's shooting at us, and we're all too old to run if things go bad." The men laughed, combat humor unchanged by the decades. Sullivan felt a familiar pre-battle focus settling over him, mind clearing of extraneous concerns to concentrate on the objective. The courthouse parking lot was already crowded when they arrived. News of the emergency hearing had apparently spread, drawing local media and curious citizens. Sullivan noted several individuals in expensive suits whom he immediately identified as Argent representatives by their bearing and the way they clustered together, checking phones and speaking in hushed tones. Mitchell was waiting at the courthouse entrance, professional in a simple dark suit but with obvious tension in her posture. Her expression lightened noticeably at the sight of the assembled veterans. "You brought reinforcements," she observed as Sullivan approached. "Old habit," he replied. "Never go into battle without overwhelming force if you can help it." Inside, they found the hearing room already filling with spectators and participants. At the front sat Maxwell Porter, immaculate in a tailored suit that suggested power and success. Sullivan recognized him immediately despite the decades since their Pentagon encounters. The same smooth confidence, the same air of technical superiority. Porter noticed Sullivan's entrance, his expression briefly registering surprise at the number of veterans accompanying him before resuming its practiced neutrality. A subtle nod was his only acknowledgement. "That's our enemy," Sullivan said quietly to Doc. "Former Pentagon analyst who disputed our T-72 findings. Now CEO of Argent and the man behind this whole operation." "Looks soft," Doc observed. "Probably never been in a real tank." "That's his weakness," Sullivan agreed. "He knows the specifications, but not the reality." The judge entered, a silver-haired woman with reading glasses and a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency in her courtroom. The proceedings began with Argent's counsel presenting their case for emergency possession, citing environmental concerns that allegedly required immediate remediation. Sullivan listened carefully as the opposing attorney outlined claims about improper handling of hazardous materials, potential groundwater contamination, and environmental regulations that supposedly gave Westfield Development rights to expedited possession of the property. When Sullivan's legal team, hastily assembled but competent, began their response, the judge interrupted. "Counselor, I understand Colonel Sullivan wishes to address the court directly. Given his unique position in this matter, I'm inclined to allow it if there are no objections." Porter's attorney started to object, but was silenced by a subtle gesture from his client. Porter himself leaned forward slightly, curious perhaps about what Sullivan might say. Sullivan approached the bench, standing straight with the bearing that had commanded men through 3 wars. He placed a single folder on the podium before him but did not immediately open it. Your Honor, I appreciate the opportunity to address these allegations directly. The environmental claims presented by Westfield Development are not only false, but represent something more concerning: an attempt to use regulatory mechanisms to achieve corporate objectives unrelated to environmental protection. He opened the folder, removing the environmental assessment Rodriguez had provided. I've submitted to the court a comprehensive environmental review of the Academy property conducted by certified specialists less than 6 months ago. This assessment, which Westfield's attorneys have not seen, demonstrates that our facility exceeds all federal and state environmental requirements. The judge accepted the document, reviewing it briefly while Porter conferred urgently with his legal team. Sullivan continued without waiting for their response. However, Your Honor, the environmental claims are merely a pretext. This case is not fundamentally about land use or regulatory compliance. It's about the future of armored warfare training and the principles that have saved American lives in combat. Sullivan proceeded to explain Black Iron's mission during Desert Storm, the intelligence they gathered about modified Soviet tanks, and how their findings contradicted official assumptions but ultimately saved American tank crews from potential disaster. The training academy Westfield seeks to shut down exists to preserve and transmit this knowledge, the kind of practical, experience-based understanding that no simulation or theoretical model can replace. Our methods emphasize human judgment, mechanical understanding, and crew survival under actual combat conditions. At this point, Mitchell approached with additional materials that Sullivan presented to the court. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a military historian with the War College, has been researching recently declassified materials about Black Iron's operations. Her findings demonstrate the historical significance of our methods and their continuing relevance to current tank doctrine. The judge examined those materials with evident interest while Porter shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sullivan sensed the tactical advantage shifting and pressed forward. Your Honor, there is a direct connection between this case and current issues of national security and service member safety. Following Desert Storm, recommendations from Black Iron led to a program called Iron Warrior, designed to improve tank crew survivability based on battlefield lessons. That program was redirected toward autonomous systems development through the intervention of one individual. Sullivan turned slightly, facing Porter directly for the first time. That individual was Maxwell Porter, then a Pentagon analyst, now CEO of Argent Defense Systems, the parent company of Westfield Development. Murmurs spread through the courtroom and Porter's expression hardened. His attorney rose to object, but Sullivan continued before he could speak. The redirection of that funding had consequences, Your Honor. 3 years ago, American tank crews died in Afghanistan when their vehicles experienced catastrophic failures that the Iron Warrior improvements would specifically have addressed. The connection between Porter's decision then and those losses now is documented in materials we've submitted to the court. The judge held up a hand, silencing the growing reaction in the courtroom. Colonel Sullivan, these are serious allegations that go well beyond the scope of a property dispute. They do, Your Honor, Sullivan agreed, because this is not merely about property. It's about whether critical knowledge that saves lives will be preserved or suppressed to advance corporate interests in autonomous weapon systems. Porter finally rose, addressing the court directly. Your Honor, Colonel Sullivan's allegations are not only irrelevant to these proceedings, but potentially defamatory. Argent Defense Systems has an exemplary record of developing technologies that protect American service members. Sullivan met Porter's gaze steadily. Then Mr. Porter should welcome the opportunity to address these connections in open court, with testimony from the men who served in Black Iron and documentation of how his interventions affected tank crew survivability programs. The tension between the two men was palpable, decades of philosophical disagreement crystallizing in this confrontation. Porter's corporate confidence against Sullivan's battle-tested certainty. Your Honor, Mitchell interjected, approaching with additional documentation. The Pentagon is declassifying the Black Iron operations next month as part of historical records release. We have advanced copies of those materials that establish both the historical significance of Colonel Sullivan's methods and their direct relevance to current armored warfare doctrine. The judge reviewed these materials thoughtfully before addressing both parties. It appears there are substantive factual disputes that cannot be resolved in an emergency hearing. I'm denying Westfield's motion for immediate possession pending a full evidentiary hearing on both the environmental claims and the historical significance issues raised by Colonel Sullivan. Relief spread through Sullivan's team, though he maintained his composed exterior. The judge continued, setting a schedule for document submission and witness testimony that would extend the process by months rather than days. Furthermore, she added, given the national security implications raised here, I'm ordering all records related to the Iron Warrior program and its redirection be preserved and submitted for in-camera review. As the hearing concluded, Sullivan gathered with his team outside the courtroom. The initial skirmish had been won, buying time and changing the terms of engagement from Argent's preferred battlefield to one where Sullivan's experience and evidence could be more effectively deployed. Porter approached as they prepared to leave, separating himself from his legal entourage to address Sullivan directly. "Impressive performance, Colonel," he said, voice modulated to project confident amusement, bringing in the old war stories and veteran sentiment. Effective theater, but ultimately irrelevant. Technology advances regardless of nostalgia. Sullivan studied the man carefully, recognizing both the arrogance and the underlying insecurity it masked. "This isn't about nostalgia, Porter. It's about what works when young Americans are inside burning tanks, something you've never experienced firsthand." "Experience is becoming obsolete, Colonel," Porter replied smoothly. "Artificial intelligence doesn't need to experience failure to avoid it. That's the fundamental advantage of our autonomous systems." "Until they face conditions they weren't programmed for," Sullivan countered. "Battlefield reality has a way of introducing variables no programmer anticipated. That's when human judgment makes the difference between survival and disaster." Porter's smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened. "The Pentagon disagrees. Our contracts for the next generation of autonomous combat vehicles were approved last week. $10 billion to replace human operators with AI systems that don't get tired, afraid, or confused. Or innovative, adaptive, or moral," Sullivan added. "Your machines will follow their programming perfectly until they encounter something unprogrammed. Then they'll fail perfectly as well." The philosophical divide between them could not have been clearer, representing competing visions of warfare that extended beyond tanks to fundamental questions about human judgment versus technological solutions. "You've won a delay, nothing more," Porter said, professional veneer slipping slightly to reveal genuine irritation. "Westfield will eventually take possession, your academy will close, and armored warfare will evolve beyond your outdated methods." Sullivan met his gaze without wavering. "We'll see. The battlefield decides what works, Porter, always has." As Porter returned to his legal team, Doc joined Sullivan, observing the exchange with a veteran's assessment. "He's worried. Wouldn't have approached personally otherwise." Sullivan nodded, having reached the same conclusion. "We've disrupted his timeline and changed the nature of the fight. Now we need to consolidate and prepare for the main engagement." The veterans regrouped at the academy, energized by the initial success but realistic about the challenges ahead. The courtroom battle had been merely the first engagement in what would likely be a prolonged campaign against an opponent with substantial resources and influence. Mitchell joined their planning session, bringing additional research on the Iron Warrior program and its connection to current tank vulnerability issues. Her historian's perspective complemented the veteran's practical experience, creating a more comprehensive understanding of how past decisions affected present capabilities. Porter wasn't exaggerating about the autonomous vehicle contracts, she confirmed, displaying recent Pentagon budget allocations. Argent is leading a consortium that received major funding for the next generation of unmanned combat vehicles. Their marketing materials specifically contrast their AI-driven approach with outdated human-centric models. Sullivan studied the materials thoughtfully. "So our academy represents both a philosophical challenge and a potential competitive threat if their systems fail to perform as promised." "Exactly," Mitchell agreed. "Your training methods preserve knowledge that could be used to evaluate their autonomous systems under realistic conditions, knowledge they'd prefer to see forgotten." Tom, who had been analyzing Argent's corporate structure, added another dimension. "There's a financial angle too. Argent's stock value is heavily tied to these autonomous vehicle contracts. Any suggestion that human operators remain necessary would threaten investor confidence." The comprehensive picture emerging revealed the true nature of the conflict, not simply a property dispute or even a disagreement about training methods, but a fundamental challenge to a multi-billion-dollar corporate strategy and the careers built upon it. As evening approached, Sullivan stepped outside once more, needing space to think beyond the tactical details being discussed inside. The Texas sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows from the training tanks across the academy grounds. Doc joined him after a few minutes, the two old soldiers standing in companionable silence, as they had countless times on distant battlefields. "What's the next move, Colonel?" Doc finally asked. Sullivan considered the question carefully. "We've secured our position temporarily, but Porter will regroup. We need to shift from defense to offense before he can." "Taking the fight to him?" "In a manner of speaking. If this were a conventional battle, we'd identify the enemy's center of gravity and concentrate our forces there." Doc nodded, following the familiar strategic thinking. Argent's autonomous vehicle contracts. "Their vulnerability is the gap between promised performance and battlefield reality," Sullivan confirmed. "We need to expose that gap credibly, not just as critics, but as experienced professionals with documented evidence." The tactical approach was taking shape in Sullivan's mind, drawing on decades of military planning adapted to this new battlefield. "We'll need congressional testimony, media coverage of the right kind, and most importantly, a direct comparison between their systems and trained human crews under realistic conditions." "A competition?" Doc suggested, interest evident in his expression. "More than that, a comprehensive evaluation under combat realistic conditions, not the sanitized tests Argent has been using to demonstrate their systems." The idea continued developing as they discussed possibilities, eventually taking form as a bold challenge. A public demonstration where Argent's autonomous tanks would compete directly against human crews trained in Sullivan's methods, under conditions approximating actual combat environments rather than controlled test ranges. When they returned inside to share this concept with the team, the response was enthusiastic but tempered with practical concerns. "Argent will never agree to this voluntarily," Tom pointed out. "They control their testing environments carefully to showcase strengths and hide weaknesses." "Then we make it impossible for them to refuse without appearing to concede," Sullivan replied. "We need leverage." Mitchell's research provided the first element of that leverage: documentation connecting the redirection of Iron Warrior funding to specific vulnerabilities in current tanks that had resulted in combat casualties. If made public, these connections would raise serious questions about Porter's judgment and Argent's priorities. Thompson contributed the second element through his intelligence contacts, evidence that Argent had systematically excluded certain combat scenarios from their autonomous vehicle testing, scenarios that specifically challenged AI decision-making under complex ethical and tactical conditions. Rodriguez completed the strategic picture by activating his network of veteran tank commanders now serving as instructors at military training facilities. These professionals could provide credible testimony about the limitations of simulation-based training compared to Sullivan's experience-driven methods. As the planning continued into the night, Sullivan felt a familiar sense of purpose that transcended the immediate conflict. This wasn't merely about saving his academy, but about preserving principles that had guided his entire military career: the value of human judgment, the importance of experience-based knowledge, and the fundamental responsibility to protect those who would someday command tanks in combat. The following morning brought unexpected allies. General Harwick arrived unannounced, having flown from Washington after hearing about the court hearing. Though retired, he retained significant influence in military circles and had commanded tank units in both Desert Storm and the Iraq War. "Porter's autonomous systems are a disaster waiting to happen," Harwick stated bluntly during their meeting. "I've seen the test reports they don't publish. Catastrophic failure rates in complex environments, especially when facing unconventional tactics." His testimony would provide crucial credibility to Sullivan's challenge, coming from a senior commander with intimate knowledge of both traditional and emerging tank warfare doctrines. Even more surprising was the arrival of Congressman James Foster, chairman of the House Armed Services Committee and a former Marine with a reputation for skepticism toward expensive defense programs with limited combat testing. "I've been watching Argent's contracts with concern," Foster explained during a private conversation with Sullivan. $10 billion for unproven technology, while we cut training budgets for actual tank crews? Something doesn't add up. With these influential allies joining their cause, Sullivan's challenge to Argent took formal shape. A congressional hearing on the future of armored warfare, featuring direct testimony from Black Iron veterans about their Desert Storm experiences and the continuing relevance of human judgment in tank operations. Central to this hearing would be Sullivan's public challenge to Porter, a head-to-head competition between Argent's autonomous tanks and crews trained using Sullivan's methods, conducted under realistic combat conditions with independent evaluation of the results. The challenge was delivered through multiple channels simultaneously: a formal letter to Argent's board of directors, press releases from Congressman Foster's office announcing the upcoming hearings, and a detailed proposal for competition parameters submitted to the Pentagon's testing division. Porter's response came swiftly through official Argent channels, a dismissive statement characterizing Sullivan's challenge as a publicity stunt by those resistant to technological progress, and reaffirming confidence in their autonomous system's superiority. Privately, however, Argent's actions told a different story. Their legal team filed motions to exclude certain testimony from the congressional hearings, particularly regarding the Iron Warrior program and its redirection. Technical teams accelerated testing of their autonomous vehicles in scenarios similar to those Sullivan had proposed for the competition. Most tellingly, Porter himself reached out to Tom through back channels, suggesting a potential compromise. Argent would withdraw its claim on the Academy property in exchange for Sullivan's retirement from public advocacy on tank warfare doctrine. He's afraid, Tom concluded when reporting this approach to his father. The challenge threatens everything he's built at Argent. Sullivan nodded, recognizing the tactical significance of this overture, which means we press harder, no compromise on principles. The congressional hearings commenced 3 weeks later, drawing significant media attention due to both the technical subject matter and the human drama of veteran tank commanders challenging a multi-billion-dollar defense program. Sullivan's testimony came on the second day after technical presentations establishing the historical context of armored warfare evolution. He spoke without notes, drawing on decades of experience to explain the fundamental importance of human judgment in tank operations. Tanks don't fight in controlled environments, he told the committee. They fight in case, in dust storms, in electromagnetic interference zones, in situations where sensors fail and communications are disrupted. Under these conditions, human crews with proper training make decisions that no algorithm can replicate. His description of Black Iron's discoveries during Desert Storm captivated the audience, particularly his account of how modified T-72 tanks had surprised American intelligence, but were effectively countered through rapid dissemination of experience-based tactical adjustments. Those adjustments came from human observers evaluating physical evidence and applying combat experience, Sullivan emphasized. No AI system programmed with existing intelligence would have identified these modifications or developed appropriate countermeasures in time. Doc, Rodriguez, and Thompson followed with supporting testimony, each bringing unique perspective from their specialized roles during Black Iron's operations. Their accounts reinforced Sullivan's core argument. Human judgment, informed by experience and technical understanding, remained irreplaceable in armored warfare despite technological advances. Mitchell presented her historical research, establishing connections between Black Iron's findings, the Iron Warrior program's redirection, and subsequent combat vulnerabilities. Her academic credentials lent credibility to what might otherwise have been dismissed as veterans' nostalgia. Porter testified on the final day, defending Argent's autonomous systems with polished confidence and impressive technical specifications. His presentation featured video demonstrations of unmanned tanks performing complex maneuvers and target engagement sequences with precision that seemed to support his claims of superiority. When questioned about Sullivan's challenge for a direct comparison under combat realistic conditions, Porter initially deflected, citing proprietary technology concerns and ongoing development schedules that supposedly prevented such demonstrations. Congressman Foster pressed the issue directly. Mr. Porter, are you saying Argent's autonomous tanks, which you've just described as superior to human crews in every respect, cannot participate in a straightforward comparison under conditions resembling actual combat? Porter's hesitation was brief but noticeable. Congressman, we welcome performance evaluation, but through established Pentagon testing protocols, not publicity contests designed by critics of automation. Colonel Sullivan's challenge specifies independent evaluation by current military testing units using standard combat effectiveness metrics, Foster countered. Are you suggesting these would be inadequate? The exchange continued, with Porter gradually losing the polished certainty that had characterized his earlier testimony. When Foster introduced documents showing that Argent had specifically excluded certain combat scenarios from their internal testing, Porter's corporate facade cracked visibly. Those scenarios represent statistically improbable situations that no responsible testing protocol would prioritize, Porter argued, his tone defensive. Yet human tank crews have faced exactly these improbable situations in actual combat, Foster observed. Colonel Sullivan's crews encountered them in Desert Storm. Others faced them in Iraq and Afghanistan. Are you saying Argent's systems are designed only for probable scenarios? The hearing concluded without resolution on the challenge question, but the public perception had shifted dramatically. Media coverage highlighted the contrast between Sullivan's combat-tested perspective and Porter's theoretical assertions, often using the evocative framing of steel warriors versus silicon soldiers. Financial analysts began questioning Argent's autonomous vehicle claims, noting discrepancies between public marketing materials and the more qualified statements Porter had made under oath. The company's stock price fluctuated as investor confidence wavered. 1 week after the hearings concluded, Porter contacted Sullivan directly, requesting a private meeting away from media attention and legal teams. They met at a neutral location, a Veterans Memorial Park halfway between the Academy and Argent's regional headquarters. Porter arrived without entourage, dressed casually rather than in his customary corporate attire. The change suggested a different approach. Perhaps recognition that the corporate tactics had failed against Sullivan's straightforward military methodology. You've made your point effectively, Colonel, Porter began as they walked among monuments to fallen soldiers. The congressional spotlight, the media coverage, the questions about our testing protocols. Very effective pressure campaign. Sullivan said nothing, allowing Porter to continue. Argent's board has authorized me to withdraw our subsidiary's claim on your Academy property, ending the legal proceedings entirely. In return, we ask only that you moderate your public criticism of our autonomous systems while development continues. Sullivan stopped walking, turning to face Porter directly. This was never about the Academy property, Mr. Porter. That was just your chosen battlefield. The real issue is whether we prepare for war based on how we wish it to be or how it actually is. Porter's expression tightened. You think I don't understand reality? I've spent my entire career analyzing combat data, developing systems that eliminate human error from the battlefield equation. Data isn't experience, Sullivan replied simply. Numbers don't capture the case. The mechanical failures, the split-second judgments that determine who lives and dies inside a tank. Your systems may perform perfectly against the threats you've programmed them to recognize, but war always presents the unexpected. Their fundamental philosophical divide remained unbridged. Two men seeing the same battlefield through entirely different lenses. Porter through algorithms and probabilities. Sullivan through human judgment and adaptability. Your challenge, Porter said after a moment, the direct comparison between our autonomous systems and your human crews. The board has reluctantly authorized me to accept, with certain conditions regarding proprietary technology protection. Sullivan hadn't expected this concession. Why the change of position? Porter's answer was surprisingly candid, because refusing has become more damaging than participating. Your congressional testimony created doubt that won't disappear through press releases or marketing campaigns. We need to address it directly. The terms were negotiated over subsequent weeks, with testing parameters designed to evaluate both autonomous and human crewed tanks under increasingly challenging conditions. The competition would begin with standard maneuvers and target engagement before progressing to degraded communications, limited visibility, unexpected obstacles, and ultimately ethical decision scenarios requiring judgment beyond tactical considerations. Preparation became Sullivan's focus, selecting and training the crew that would represent human capability against Argent's technology. He chose experienced tankers supplemented with younger operators who had trained at his academy, creating teams that combined combat experience with current technical knowledge. The competition itself unfolded over 3 days at a military testing facility modified to incorporate both structured evaluation courses and more unpredictable elements designed to test adaptability. Media access was controlled but substantial, with live coverage of certain segments, bringing unprecedented public attention to the nuances of tank warfare doctrine. Argent's autonomous tanks performed impressively in the initial phases, demonstrating superior precision in target engagement under optimal conditions. Porter's team projected confidence, their systems operating with machine perfection in situations resembling their carefully controlled internal testing. The tide began turning during scenarios involving degraded operational conditions, dust storms reducing sensor effectiveness, electromagnetic interference disrupting communications, unexpected obstacles requiring route recalculation. Human crews adapted more quickly to these changing circumstances, drawing on training and experience to maintain combat effectiveness, where autonomous systems hesitated or defaulted to conservative protocols. The most dramatic moments came during the final phase, involving simulated civilian presence in a combat zone. The autonomous tanks, programmed with rules of engagement that prioritize mission completion while minimizing civilian casualties, struggled with ambiguous situations where tactical and ethical considerations conflicted. Human crews, guided by Sullivan's training emphasis on judgment rather than rigid protocols, demonstrated superior decision-making in these complex scenarios. They found solutions that balanced mission requirements with ethical constraints, showing flexibility that the autonomous systems couldn't match. The results, evaluated by independent military testing specialists, validated Sullivan's core argument. While technology offered significant advantages in specific applications, human judgment remained irreplaceable in the chaotic, unpredictable environment of actual combat. The aftermath transformed both the immediate conflict and the broader debate about automation in warfare. Argent's stock initially declined as investors reassessed the timeline for fully autonomous combat vehicles, though Porter skillfully repositioned the company toward augmentation technologies that enhanced human operators rather than replacing them. Congressional funding priorities shifted, maintaining investment in autonomous systems research, but increasing support for experience-based training programs that preserved the human judgment elements Sullivan had championed. The Pentagon established a formal review of the Iron Warrior concepts, examining how crew survivability improvements might be incorporated into current and future tank designs. For Sullivan personally, the victory brought both vindication and perspective. The Academy property was secure, its historical significance now formally recognized through designation as a National Training Heritage Site. More importantly, the principles he had defended throughout his career received renewed acknowledgement within military doctrine. The final resolution came not through defeat of technology, but through integration of human and machine capabilities. Sullivan's Academy evolved to incorporate emerging technologies while maintaining its core emphasis on human judgment and experience-based knowledge. Some of Argent's engineers, impressed by the competition results, joined collaborative projects to develop systems that supported rather than supplanted human operators. On the anniversary of Desert Storm, 1 year after the conflict with Argent began, Sullivan stood among his old Black Iron crew at a ceremony dedicating a permanent exhibition on their mission and findings. The display included artifacts, photographs, technical drawings, and first-hand accounts preserved by the veterans who had served together in that distant desert war. Doc Williams, standing beside him as the ribbon was cut, spoke quietly. "Full circle, Jack. From gathering intelligence on Soviet tanks to preserving the knowledge for generations that will never know what we faced." Sullivan nodded, watching young officers examining the exhibits with professional curiosity. The vehicles change, the technology evolves, but the fundamental truth remains. In the chaos of battle, human judgment still makes the difference between disaster and survival. As the ceremony concluded, Sullivan found himself approached by a young lieutenant preparing for her first tank command deployment. Her questions about Desert Storm experiences gradually shifted to more personal territory. "Colonel," she asked finally, "with everything you've seen across 3 wars and all these technological changes, what's the most important lesson for a new tank commander?" Sullivan considered carefully before answering, aware that his words might travel with this young officer into future battlefields he would never see. "Know your vehicle completely," he began, echoing advice his father had given him decades earlier. "Understand its capabilities and limitations intimately, but remember that tanks are ultimately tools. The true weapon system is the crew, the human judgment, courage, and adaptability inside that steel shell." The lieutenant nodded, absorbing his words with evident seriousness. "And one more thing," Sullivan added. "The most important decision you'll ever make isn't about enemy engagement or tactical positioning. It's recognizing when to get your crew out of a damaged tank. Steel can be replaced. Good crews cannot. As she thanked him and moved on, Sullivan felt the weight of legacy, not just his own or his father's, but the collective experience of generations of tank commanders who had faced death inside armored vehicles and passed their hard-earned wisdom to those who followed. Tom joined him then, their relationship gradually healing through shared purpose despite lingering differences. The Pentagon's implementing the first Iron Warrior survivability improvements, he reported, incorporating them into the next Abrams upgrade package. They're calling it the Sullivan Protocol for Crew Extraction Systems. The news brought quiet satisfaction rather than pride. Names and recognition meant little compared to the lives that might someday be saved by these improvements. As evening approached and the ceremony crowd dispersed, Sullivan took a final walk among the training tanks that had defined his second career. The massive vehicles stood silently under the Texas sunset, their silhouettes unchanged yet somehow different. No longer just machines, but repositories of knowledge, experience, and human judgment that had proven its enduring value against all challenges. The battle had been won, not through destruction of the enemy, but through demonstration of truth, that in the chaos of war, when systems fail and plans collapse, the human element remains the decisive factor. It was a lesson written in steel and blood across generations of conflict, preserved now for those yet to command the armored giants that would continue evolving long after Sullivan's generation had passed into history. This legacy would continue through the academy, through the soldiers trained in Sullivan's methods, and through the Sullivan family tradition that might yet extend to future generations. Not a legacy of war itself, but of the wisdom that minimized its cost in human lives. The steel legacy that had begun with his father's Sherman tank in World War II and would continue through whatever armored vehicles might dominate future battlefields. As darkness fell, Sullivan returned to his office where his father's tankard still occupied its place of honor. He lifted it in a silent toast to absent comrades, to lessons learned at terrible cost, and to the young officers who would carry those lessons into an uncertain future. The battle for the academy was over, but the greater mission continued, preserving the human wisdom that no technology could replace. The judgment forged in fire and passed from generation to generation of those who commanded steel giants in humanity's most desperate hours.